Why is it that all the news on trans people seem to always revolve around trans women? Kind of the same reason people aren't as angry about women being lesbian than guys being gay. Being associated with femininity when you're a guy equals bad. Being associated with masculinity when you're a girl equals cool. A tomboy. Obviously this is an overly large simplification. People view all penis havers as potential predators. Hence the whole bathroom scare. Women are also predators, but they aren't assumed to be. Trans men don't have a lot of sports scandals because trans men tend to not perform better in sports than cis men. Trans men aren't as useful in selling the moral panic. Elliot Page and Chaz Bono have both been in the news in recent years. For what it's worth, but 100% agree with the comments pointing out misogyny as a major factor. The idea of men going into women's bathrooms and changing rooms is much more useful to the folks trying to sell fear and paranoia of trans people. Basically because of the cultural attitudes we have towards men as opposed to women. Trans women are seen as men, and men are often seen as better, more athletic, but also more likely to be creeps. Also, if you are trying to think of a famous trans man, Elliot Page would be one. Because it's easier to make trans people look bad if you say, men are disguising as women. Quote, men are invading women's sports. Quote, but what if men pretend to be trans to go in women's bathrooms? Any one of them could be a pervy man. Quote, they want to do the same thing to trans people as they did to gay people decades ago. Paint us as pedos and rapists so they're justified in discriminating against us and can bend the law against us. 1. Unfair advantage in sports, whether perceived or not. 2. Presumably, women are more likely to be offended by a trans woman, born a biological man, to be the girl's bathroom, than a man would be offended by a former woman, trans man, being in the boys' room. 3. Perceived presumption that people born as biological men are more sexually deviated than people born as biological women. Because we police what ideal womanhood is a hell of a lot more than how we police manhood. My partner is trans and he has had no issues integrating socially as a man. Trans women on the other hand have to conform to the many absurd demands and expectations of the typified women. Typically, controversial stories lead the news, and trans women setting records in sports and being seen as unfair competition for women's athletics creates said controversy. It will be a surprise if a trans man suddenly becomes the next men's MMA champion. But for a trans woman to become the women's MMA champion, it's more of a likelihood than an anomaly. A lot of it is also there's just more trans women than trans men. Even in trans spaces online there's just many more women than men. Because trans men tend to try to blend in with other men as much as possible. As a cisgender man, I can tell you masculine culture can be very toxic. So a trans man calling attention to himself is running a risk of physical harm. It's easier to pass as a man than it is to pass as a woman. And the vast majority of issues are about non-passing trans people. Insensitive as it may be, trans men are generally easily recognizable as men. But trans women are more often than not very clearly a man in a dress. Most civilizations separate males and females in many spaces for the protection and comfort of females. There may be certain benefits or protections afforded to females to attempt to make up for physical and prejudicial disadvantages. The argument, whether you agree with it or not, is that males may gain access to these areas and privileges simply on their word, which puts females at risk. The inverse doesn't really have any bullet point talking points you hinge on. You can't really sell the idea that trans men in prisons, bathroom, sports etc. are a potential danger to people around them. To push any fear about trans men, you pretty much need to simultaneously make the case that men have significant social and legal benefits that are at risk of being fraudulently appropriated by trans men. Not to generalize too hard here, but I've never seen any anti-trans activists that agree with that point. Most of the answers here are clearly not written by trans men. Space or no space. Never a hyphen. Conservatives do not neatly separate masculinity from AMAB bodies and femininity from AFAB bodies, and subtly admire AFAB trans people for being masculine. Conservatives hate gender nonconformity, and the reason trans women are an easier target is that they are more visibly gender nonconforming as a whole, since they are less likely to pass as cis. Both directions are seen as failures to live up to gender roles. When an AFAB trans person is openly trans, either because they visibly don't pass or because they talk about it, conservatives are more than happy to use the language of grooming, mutilation, mentally ill, confused little girl. It's disingenuous to say conservatives on the whole are somehow okay with trans men in a way they aren't with trans women. Their contempt is different, but it comes from the same place. The reason there are few visible trans athletes is that trans men rarely try out for, let alone make the cut for, men's sports. You get someone like Mac Beggs when a trans man who wants to compete with men is forced to compete against women. Because most gendered spaces exist for the privacy, protection, and general benefit of women, whether it's athletics or washrooms. If an actual woman entered the men's gender-neutral space, men might find it odd but generally wouldn't mind. If a man entered the women's space, they would be perceived as a threat. Women's spaces were never intended to be something you could opt into. They were for people who needed that space because they happened to be women. Also, society seems to be more inclined to protect women in general. The women themselves want to feel safe, and properly socialized men also tend to protect women. So when you have people deciding which space they think they qualify to enter, it's more of a threat to women, and it creates an exploit for men who want to take advantage of it. That doesn't mean there aren't trans women who would politely use the ladies' room like a normal person, but it does also select for a separate group of predatory men. I don't think it's the mixing per se that's seen as a problem. It's the self-identification without any test or demonstration of sincerity that makes it exploitable. I am very excited to answer this. TLDR. It has to do with the ideas people have about sex, gender, and sexuality, and what it means to be a man or to be a woman. Because many people have very deeply rooted categories for others in their head due to the ways society views men and women. Their attempts to reconcile trans men and women within their existing belief system leads to a desexualization of trans men and an assumption that trans women are sexually predatory. The latter of which is a highly inflammatory topic that gets a lot of buzz. Source: I transitioned FTM. Then after several years I detransitioned. Therefore I have a lot of experience in the trans community and am close with many trans people. In addition, I was fetishized and tokenized by TERFs upon my choice to publicly detransition. As such, I was exposed to a lot of their conversations and ways of thinking. I am doing well and don't associate myself with them. Disclaimer that I am speaking very broadly and generally here. In the world we live in, people will typically correlate sexuality and gender identity to some degree due to the lines that have been drawn between biological sex and gender roles. Those of us observed to be female at birth and socialized as girls have our sexualities demonized, repressed, shunned, and made to disappear, unless we are performing it or marketing it as an object for consumption for men. People observed to be male at birth and socialized as boys, however, are seen as naturally sexually active and voracious creatures, even to the extent of being made out to be uncontrollable animals for having sexuality. So, extending that idea further, trans men are considered a sexual anomaly to the majority of the population. When presented with trans people, many people have to grapple with their ideas about men, women, masculinity and femininity and sexuality and then fit them into their ideas about how people are. And when it comes to trans men, many people are on some level trying to work out the following mental puzzle. If they view a trans man's choice to live as a man as an acceptable and understandable one, then they would have to automatically place that person, a fab, into the category of people in their head, men, that society has categorized as being sexually voracious, dominant, and assertive. But because the nature of being a trans man requires oneself to have been observed female at birth and raised as a girl, many people struggle to reconcile their idea of a man with somebody who would otherwise, based on their observed female sex at birth, have been placed into a category that would have them being perceived as having a more receptive, subtle, submissive sexuality, one that is either inappropriate and private, or used explicitly for male consumption. To cope with this confusion, many people on a subconscious level choose to dismiss or disregard trans men as sexual beings at all, and instead infantilize or desexualize them entirely in their head. This is why, when you do see trans men or non-binary fab people in media, or in a representatory way at all, they are pretty much always exclusively presented as a dull sexless being. There are even jokes in the community about it, like, if you're a fab and you want to find gender-neutral, androgynous, or masculine representation or clothes, the only things out there are representative of pretty blandly styled thin white people in shapeless, formless, gray amorphous clothing. That is the extent to which society will allow born female people to be perceived as non-women, unless they are doing something which fits into society's idea of what a born female person's sexuality is made for, such as being pregnant, which you mention in your post. Personally, I also think this has to do with the fact that for many trans men, transition includes binding or and top surgery. And because fab people are perceived as sexual objects, once they choose to disassociate themselves from those highly objectified body parts, people tend to see them as having lost their sexual value, and they become invisible. In contrast, born male people are perceived in a sexually voracious and aggressive way and are seen as being that way naturally and inherently. When somebody transitions from male to female, then there is a more conscious, challenging mental reconciliation that has to happen on the part of most people if they're going to attempt to understand and allow that trans woman to be seen and represented, as well as to fit that trans woman into their idea of how people are, what a man is and what it means to be one, as well as what a woman is and what it is to be one. Seeing and reconciling with the existence of trans femininity requires a more active effort for many people in getting curious their own belief systems about these things, which is challenging. So in contrast to how trans men are perceived, people often automatically will focus on or consider a trans woman to have an actively sexual motivation behind her transition, because they perceive amab people as being like naturally sexually deviant creatures who are controlled and ruled by their sexuality. In contrast, very few people are likely to consider a trans man's motivations for transitioning as being sexual. due to their already preconceived notions about the nature of sexuality in a fab people. Many people are trying to reconcile their ideas about men and women into their understanding of trans people, and while doing so are dealing with cognitive dissonance. Because of how people see AMAB people as being in possession of an inherently sexually motivated nature, they struggle to reconcile that idea with this person's choice to live their life as a woman, which is in part because women's sexualities have been seen as only existing to be a commodity to satisfy the male gaze. Essentially, they reach the mental impasse of not comprehending why this person, someone who, in their minds, is ruled by active sexuality, would want to be live their lives as someone who, in their mind, is a sexual object. They are confused by trans women, who they believe, for some incomprehensible to them reason, make a choice to be an object of sexual desire and scrutiny. Because that is what women are. And because they see trans women as people who are inherently sexually motivated, and are still viewing them through the lens of everything thatistide to the iridias of maleness. The only conclusion they are able to come to as to why someone would live a life like that is an assumption that there must be exclusively fetishistic motivations on the part of trans women, because sexual fetishists are societally perceived as inherently dangerous, disgusting, predatory, slimy, and repulsive. The cultural narrative around trans women is a much louder and reactive one than that of the infantilized, sad, desexed trans man. I brought this up to my mom, but in my experience it's BC butch lesbians became more acceptable around 2015. When I came out, for almost 10 years, I was confused for a butch woman rather than a short guy. Because women can do what a man can do. I personally view it as a stark fear of femininity on top of discomfort with a mostly invisible population. I think the difference in controversy is because most trans women have a physical advantage over cis women. They have a larger lung capacity, upper body strength, different center of gravity, denser bones, etc. It gives them an advantage when competing for sports scholarships. Public restrooms can be dangerous for women and trans people. I had a pedophile follow me into the restroom when I was a girl. I think the risk could be lowered by having at least a few private public restrooms available. A lot of men, for some reason, have a weird relationship with the idea of trans women. Whether it's because they feel it as a threat to their masculinity, sexuality, or whatever, the idea that they could somehow be tricked into being attracted to a trans woman often comes up.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.